What are the best trout rivers in America? Like, hands down, the places that every fly angler needs to go fish at least once before they pass on to that great river in the sky. And what makes a river great anyways? Why do we hold some fisheries in such high regard? On today's episode of Untangled, you'll hear my list of the 10 best trout rivers in America, and I'll share why each of them belong on a list like that. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durrant. I've got a fun announcement to make later on in the show, so stay tuned for that. But before we get to it, like we do every week, we got to get to the meat and potatoes of this week's show. And that is something, it's a little bit different, right? It's fun, it's laid back, and it's a topic that I am positive is going to start some good discussion in the VFC community, and that is the top 10 trout rivers in America. I put together a list of what I consider to be the best trout rivers in the country, and this was done according to my own highly scientific and proprietary ranking formula, so we know that it's beyond reproach and 100% foolproof. And it shouldn't surprise anybody that the Provo River is head and shoulders above every trout fishery, not just in America, but on the planet, with the Henry's Fork a distant second. All right, all kidding around. I know that best is a subjective term. That's what makes these lists and doing this so much fun, is what I think is the best might not be what you think is the best, or whoever else. So I do want to disclose how I put this list together, the criteria I used to pick the rivers that made this list. And with one exception, which I'll get to in a minute, every river that's on this list meets all of these criteria very well. So let's just dive into them. There's 4, and I'll explain these, and then we'll get to the list, right? So the first criteria, and these aren't weighted, like one of them doesn't hold more value than the other. This is just a river had to meet these if it wanted to make the list, right? And the first thing that a river needs to offer, that first criteria, is it needs to give you a good fishing experience. Now, that's hard to quantify, again, because what I think is a good experience might be different, but if a river is going to be truly great, it needs to give anglers that good fishing experience. So what I mean by that is a few things, okay? First off is, even if that river's crowded, there should still be plenty of water to go around, right? Even if you're there on Memorial Day and everybody's there, you're not elbow to elbow with 300 of your closest friends from every other state in the country, right? We don't want that to be the experience you have, because that's just not fun. I've fished those really crowded rivers, and it's an experience, but I don't know that I would call it good, right? So enough water to go around for everybody. I also think that the scenery plays an important role. The scenery should be great. It should be beautiful. Trout live in beautiful places, and one of the funnest things about chasing trout is that we get to go to where they live, which is some of the most beautiful country on the planet, not just in our country, but in the whole planet. It's amazing where trout live. And I also think that the river should feel like a classic trout river. Now, this is another subjective term that could be kind of hard to understand, but if anybody's ever been to Southwest Montana, they'll understand what I mean by this. Whenever you go to Southwest Montana, I mean, you could be driving over an irrigation ditch and it's going to feel fishy, because there's so much lore and so much mythology around all those fisheries, the Big Hole and the Madison and the Gallatin and the Jefferson and all those fisheries that you get to, that you step out of the truck, you're just like, oh, it's fishy here, right? It just feels like a classic trout river. It's got the look, it's got the scenery, it's got that very hard to describe feeling about it, that you just know it's going to be a good place. I think great trout rivers need to have that, right? There also should be a reasonable chance at catching a trout above 15 inches. Now, I'm not telling you that everything needs to be 20 inches, right? Because we all know, we've all met that angler who you get off the river and you're milling around. Maybe you're at the bar, or you're at the fly shop, or wherever after a day on the water, and you're talking to a feller, and he's like, oh, yeah, Everything we put in the boat today was 20 inchers. I caught a couple 24s, and we even saw a 27, but it got away. All right, first off, we know that guy's lying, and that's just not fun. Okay, but I don't think a fishery needs to give you 27-inch trout every day in order to be great. But the chance at putting a couple 18-inchers, a little bit bigger in the net, that's satisfying. That's a fun experience. And breaking that 15-inch mark it's not always common, especially on a lot of smaller streams. So being able to have the opportunity to put a bigger fish in the net contributes to making a place have a great fishing experience. And I think that's important. I also think it's important to have a good variety of trout as well. If it's all rainbows or all browns, I mean, I'm not going to knock a place just like one trout's not better than another, but I like catching more than one species of trout in a day because they behave differently and they present different opportunities to anglers. So I believe that should play into it as well. All right, so that all falls under the umbrella of a good fishing experience. Now, we're going to move on to the second criteria, which is great hatches. Great trout fishing is often associated with a great hatch. So any truly fantastic river needs good hatches and a good variety of them. It needs spring blue-winged olives, PMDs, caddis, some stoneflies, and then some good fall hatches of blue wings and tricos. It needs to give the angler a lot of different opportunities to fish different bugs throughout the year and to bring fish to the surface because as much as we might joke about it, there's something special about catching fish on a dry fly and having the opportunity to do it, right? You want to be able to do that. The third criteria is that you shouldn't require a float plane to get there because not all of us literally have money to burn. And I'm not knocking folks who go out on float planes all the time, of course. First off, and I tip my hat to you. I'm glad that you're in a place where you can experience that. But I honestly could just do this entire list as the 10 best trout rivers in Alaska, and they would probably be the 10 best in the country, to be completely honest with you. But we can't all get to the Kvichak or the Kobuk or the Naknek rivers. Okay, as amazing as those fisheries are, they're also not year-round fisheries either, and it's extremely cost prohibitive to get to them. Okay, even I'm lucky enough that I get to do some Alaska trips on the cheap because I have friends who live there, and that cuts down on transportation and lodging costs exponentially. Even with that, I still have never been to those rivers as much as I'd love to. So I just can't throw rivers like that on this list. And, it's my list anyway, so I'm going to make the rules. But as amazing as those fisheries are, I wanted to focus on fisheries that we could all experience as anglers. Right? And the last criteria is that the river needs to be publicly accessible. Every great trout river should be mostly publicly accessible for wading anglers. Okay? We all can't afford a drift boat trip either. Those are getting a little bit pricier these days as well. So a river that's open to the public to wade through it is very important. And that actually takes a few of my favorite Wyoming rivers that I was toying around with putting on this list. That takes them out of the running because most of them flow through private land, and you can't wade through private land here in the Cowboy State. You have to float over it. You can't even drop an anchor because that's considered trespassing. You just have to float right on through. So if a river is going to make this list, it's got to be publicly accessible and for the wading angler as well. All right, unlike other lists on Untangled, because I do lists on the show from time to time. I usually don't put anything in order, but I have put this one in order. So the river at number 1 on this list is the river that I firmly believe, and I'll stick to this, it's the best trout river in America. And I'm 100% right, so don't try to argue. Before we do jump into the list, though, there are 2 honorable mentions that are worth talking about, and that would be the Bighorn and the Missouri. They are both amazing trout fisheries. I have not fished the Bighorn yet, which is a sin because I'm not that far from it since I moved to Wyoming. But and I'm talking about the Montana Bighorn, by the way, below Fort Smith there. And then the Missouri as well. I've fished the Missouri a couple of times. They're both amazing. There just wasn't room for me to fit them in here, and I think you'll understand why once we get into the list. But those 2 honorable mentions, I didn't leave them out because I hate the Bighorn and the Missouri, and I didn't leave your favorite river off here because I have a vendetta. It's just, it's what fit. It's what felt right. And with that out of the way, river number 10 coming at you, the Delaware. All branches of the Delaware River. It's the quintessential river on the East Coast, and a lot of folks I know who live out there say it's the best trout fishing in the lower 48 outside of the Rockies. I've never fished the Delaware, but it has earned a reputation for a reason. The hatches are prolific, and I even know a few anglers who will fish mouse flies at night during the summer, and they do really well for some pretty nice brown trout. So it's a very diverse fishery, gives you some different options. As an angler, it's not very far from New York City, which is really, I think that kind of adds to the mystique of it, right? You've got New York City, and then I think it's like a 2.5 hour drive to parts of the Delaware from there, and then boom, you're in this amazing trout river. I think that's cool. That juxtaposition is fun to look at. So I'm sure there's less crowded options out east, but I think it's hard to beat what the Delaware offers. All right. So that's the Delaware for you folks. Number 10. Number 9. Coming in number 9 is the White River in Arkansas. If you want really big brown trout, I don't know that I would tell you to go anywhere else other than the White River. That's what the river's built its reputation on. For those who don't know about it, go to Instagram while you're listening to this show and just look on Instagram, White River, Arkansas, and you're going to be blown away at the size of some of the brown trout that come out of there. It's crazy. It's just a huge fish factory. You'll obviously be throwing streamers to catch those giant browns, but the white isn't just streamers for big fish. It's also got decent enough hatches throughout the summer that you ought to give the place some serious consideration. It's not a purely fly fishing destination like some of these other rivers. There are a lot of gear anglers who go there. There's nothing wrong with that. But it may not be that pure fly fishing experience that you are looking for. So that's it for the White River in Arkansas. Coming in at number 8 is the South Platte. All sections of the South Platte I'm going to include here in Colorado deserve their fame, even if they can be crowded, and the trout that live in them love tiny bucks, as Alex can attest to. He spent some time living in Colorado a couple of years ago, and it was so funny because he'd text me like, dude, I was fishing size 20s today, and they weren't small enough. And from what I understand, that's a lot of how the South Platte is. Just, you got to go small, and it's the definition of picky tailwater fish. But there's so much water in that South Platte system, and there's great hatches too. It's a wonderful fishery. There's a lot of fish available. You've got the Dream Stream section. You got the very famous Cheeseman Canyon section. There's just tons of water here, and even when it's crowded, the fishing can be exceptional. I know a couple of guides out there who have built wonderful careers for themselves on that river, and it looks every bit as great as you would want a good Western tailwater to be. The hatches make for very technical match the hatch dry fly fishing, and even match the nymph fishing sometimes as well, which can be a lot of fun if you enjoy being frustrated all the time. So honestly, it's kind of like teaching high school. I'm kidding. All right. The South Platte also offers a lot of great year-round fishing, which I value a lot. It's just hard to overstate how dependable and how good the South Platte can be. Coming in at number 7 is none other than the legendary Firehole River, right? This is not arguably, I think this is, we can say definitively, the most unique trout river in the world because you're fishing next to geysers. Some of them are even spilling into the river itself. There's bison everywhere and 500,000 of your closest friends. So don't fish the Firehole unless you love being in random people's vacation pictures because you'll probably end up in them. Even though the Firehole can be pretty crowded at times, every time I've been when it's crowded, the other anglers have been very great. The stream etiquettes are really good there. Folks are good about not squeezing, and it's not elbow to elbow fishing, but it's going to be very rare for you to show up and have the whole place to yourself. So don't expect that. Expect to see plenty of other anglers, but every time I've fished it with crowds, it's been a very pleasant experience. Now, the crowds don't really detract from it because it's Yellowstone. Come on, it's amazing. And the bug hatches there are just, They're some of the best bug hatches I've seen anywhere. To be completely honest, they're incredible. The only real knocks against it are that the season is kind of short, and this is why I put it at number 7. I think other folks might have it higher, but the season is short because Yellowstone doesn't open until Memorial Day, so you can't get in there to fly fish until then. And then the fire hole itself really stops fishing from about July through the end of August. Just depends on how warm it is out in Yellowstone, because the fire hole, with all the geysers and whatnot, it's warm water. It's warmer than a lot of other trout streams. So once it starts to get really hot, that water just starts to bake, turns into an oven. And you obviously don't want to fish for trout when it's super warm in the water. So the season on the fire hole is kind of short. And there aren't exactly big fish in the fire hole either. And this is the one river where your chances at something over 15 inches just, they're in there, but it's tough sledding to catch something that big on the fire hole. I overlooked that. This is the one river that doesn't meet the criteria that I mentioned earlier. I overlooked that just because the fire hole is so incredible that I reckon everybody should try to fish it at least once. It's such an amazing river. It's such a wonderfully fun experience. You got to get out there and try it. All right, coming in at number 6 is none other. It's close to the fire hole. The Madison, right? The big hole might be more secluded, and there are plenty of other rivers in that area that might have some bigger trout. And even though a random July day will look like the guides are playing bumper boats instead of rowing a good drift because the river is so crowded, how can you knock it? How can you not say that the Madison is fantastic? I mean, the hatches are outstanding, right? It fishes well from late winter through late fall. It's a great fishery for a good chunk of the year. There's a bunch of trout in it, and I think it's in the prettiest part of Montana. I love that part of Montana, and it's incredibly accessible even if you don't have a drift boat. You don't have to have a drift boat to fish it. Of all of Montana's famous rivers, I have the softest spot for the Madison because it's so much fun to fish. There's so much lore around it. There's so much mythology around it. And honestly, it lives up to it. You're going to go there and have a good day. You won't have it yourself if you go during the summer, but I have been there in a late May and I had the entire $3 bridge access site to myself. So it is possible to get there during the less busy season and have a good stretch of river to yourself. I don't fish the Madison as much as I should probably. And, if you show up to the Madison and for some reason it's not fishing well, then you're only a stone's throw from Yellowstone and a ton of other great trout fisheries. So, again, it's just hard for me to knock the Madison down at all. It's just a wonderfully dependable fishery. All right, number 5, the 5th best trout river in America, the AuSable over there in Michigan. This is a legendary piece of water in fly fishing, thanks to the numerous springs that feed it and make the conditions on the river absolutely perfect for trout fishing. There's even a fly-only section of the river called the Holy Water. I mean, how could you not want to fish a place that's literally called the Holy Water? that just sounds awesome. And then Trout Unlimited, the conservation group, was founded on the banks of the AuSable, and the river is constantly lauded for its unrivaled beauty. Go take a look at some pictures of this place. It's absolutely gorgeous. The river conditions, the bug life just lend themselves to wonderful, wonderful brown trout fishing. And in that same vein, it's regarded as the best brown trout fishery outside of the Rockies. It's got prolific hatches. The wade fishing is great. And there's tons of other smaller streams that feed into the AuSable. So there's a lot to fish within that greater area. It's a gem. It's outside of our quote unquote traditional trout fishing area because it's not in the Rockies. But I mean, if we wanted to get real technical with the traditional thing, we'd talk about the Catskills because that's where a lot of dry fly fishing in America was born. But the AuSable is definitely worthy of being number 5 on this list. And coming in at number 4 is none other than the Deschutes. It's hard to narrow down all of the rivers in the Pacific Northwest, but the Deschutes, I think it takes the cake. You've got a bunch of native red band trout and probably the best salmon fly hatch in the country. Some folks might disagree with me on that, but all the experiences I've seen of folks with salmon flies on the Deschutes, that's something I need to get out and do. It's hard to be like, oh, I'm going to go to salmon flies on the Deschutes when I literally have to cross the South Fork of the Snake, the Henry's Fork, and the Madison just to drive to the Deschutes. So I always get stuck trying to go over there because I've got such great stuff over here. But by all accounts, the salmon fly hatches over there are just incredible. And then on top of that, you've got the chance to hook into summer steelhead in the river too, which is just amazing. Who doesn't want that opportunity if, it's there? I mean, what more could you ask for? The Deschutes is a wonderful little fishery, and I think it'd be hard to overlook it. It definitely earns a top 4 ranking. Now, we're getting into the top 3 here. So coming in at number 3 is the Yellowstone, right? The whole stretch of it from all the way up in the thoroughfare down to where it dumps into the Missouri. The river is incredible. It's got big cutthroat. You've got a true wilderness experience if you want to be up in that thoroughfare area. You've got fantastic dry fly fishing. It offers decent year-round fishing. I floated the just up from Livingston in, I think that was December of 2023. And through streamers, got into a little tiny dry fly hatch in December. So, it'll fish year-round, which is pretty cool. There's wonderful access to it, and that Yellowstone area, it's the prettiest place in the whole country. So I don't know how you can beat what the Yellowstone offers, especially with all the cutthroat that are still in there. It's just so much fun. And then there's plenty of browns and rainbows too. So there's all sorts of fish in the Yellowstone. Number 2, the second best, playing second fiddle to our number 1, is the South Fork of the Snake. I'll go on record here and tell you that this is the best dry fly river in America. Seriously, it is. It's stuffed full of cutthroat, plus you've got rainbows and browns in there, but we know that cutthroat are very willing to take dry flies, and there's a lot. There are a lot of cutthroat in the South Fork of the Snake. I think you're going to be hard-pressed to find better dry fly fishing anywhere, and I'll stake my claim on that. There's tons of fish. The river is absolutely gorgeous. It comes out of Palisades Reservoir, and then it flows for a bit before it hits the Henry's Fork and that Swan Valley section. It's so beautiful. If you've never been there, you definitely need to go see it. It's one of the prettiest rivers, the prettiest areas in the country. It's just gorgeous. This river really does just meet all my criteria. And if it wasn't for the existence of the number 1 river, then the South Fork of the Snake would be number 1. But the best river in America, hands down, is the Green. And I'm sure that's not going to surprise longtime listeners of the show, because I talk about my love affair with the Green all the time. But specifically, I'm talking about the Utah section from Flaming Gorge to the Colorado state line. In the first 7 miles of the river, there's an average of 12,000 fish per mile, and those fish are all almost 17 inches long on average. They're big, and there's a ton of them, which is not what you want to remember when you spend all morning not catching them. That there's 12,000 fish per mile, and I can't catch one. It's not something that you want to remind yourself of. But the Green's blue wing hatches are the best I've ever seen. I've never been anywhere that has a better blue winged olive hatch than the Green River. Alex and I got to fish it earlier this year, and Alex had actually never been on the blue wing hatch on the Green, and he was like a kid on Christmas. It was so much fun to bring somebody along who'd never experienced that before. It was so much fun. The caddis and the yellow sallies are incredible on the Green. The cicada fishing is wonderful, and it's my favorite river to go fish streamers on. It's got it all. It's great for wading when the flows are right, which the majority of the year the flows are just fine for wading. And there's even a trail that goes from the dam down to the first takeout, 7 miles long. You can hike the whole trail and wade all along it. There's so much water for you to play with right there. It's a great drift boat river, obviously. That's how most folks fish it. And even when it's really crowded in the summer, if you go out early or go out late, you can find some water to stretch out and get your own fish. It's hard to overstate just how great the Green is. And I firmly believe that the more time folks spend on the Green, the better anglers are going to become, because it is a river that demands demands the best from the folks who go to fish it. So hopefully you guys had some fun with that list, and I'm sure some folks might disagree with me or whatnot, but if you've got your own list or you think I made a glaring omission, then leave us a comment. We want to hear about it, and I'm being completely serious. I would love to see what y'all think are the 10 best trout rivers in America. So don't be afraid to drop comments if you're watching this podcast on YouTube. And with that, folks, it is time to get into the Q&A section of this week's show.
One of the most frequently asked questions we get from both beginners and experienced anglers is, what fly should I use? With the thousands of fly patterns that exist, it can be completely overwhelming. That's why we've put together an entire ebook that walks you through everything about bugs and picking the right fly no matter where you're fishing. So if you want to level up your skills and start catching more fish, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this ebook for free. All right, back to the show.
Before we get into the Q&A section of this week's show, I want to make that announcement that I teased at the beginning of this week's show, and that is that we are introducing a brand new segment to Untangled. Now, our motto here, or our motivational phrase / our corporate boilerplate here at VFC, is we want to live real life, and that's spelled REEL because we're punny like that. All right, all kidding aside, that phrase, live real life, it encapsulates what we believe in, which is the spirit of adventure and curiosity that fly fishing embodies. It's why a lot of us are drawn to fly fishing in the first place. There's some adventure and curiosity in it that you don't find in other pursuits. And our entire goal at VFC is to help anglers live real life by getting out on the water and enjoying the heck out of their time out there. Reduce the frustration, help them catch more fish, help them understand the why behind things. That's our guiding principle here. And we really want to highlight the folks who are living their real life. So starting today, we will have a live real life segment at the end of every show. And what we would like for you to do is, folks, we'd like you to send in a picture of a great fish you caught or somewhere awesome that you went fishing, and some kind of text to accompany it. A short story. It could be like literally it's just a paragraph, but just tell us about the experience. Describe the experience that you had. Tell us about the highs and the lows, or just the lows, but share the adventure. Tell us about what happened. Tell us about something you learned or something interesting that you experienced. We want to hear what you're up to. We want to see what you're up to, and we want to share that with the entire VFC community. We'll share the picture and your accompanying description about it on the show every single week. So if you're not watching the YouTube version of the show, you can click over to that to see the pictures. But we'll obviously do this on the audio version of the show as well. And there is a link in the show notes to submit your live real life moment. And there will be in every episode moving forward. So that's how you can submit those to us, is use the link in the show notes to send us your live real life moment. And I'm looking forward to doing the one today. Now, with that out of the way, let's dive into the Q&A section. And Chris from Massachusetts is going to lead us off this week with his question. Writes in and says, "Hello, sometimes we don't get a choice as to when we have the opportunity to go fishing. Our free days come when they come, and they may not be when it's the best time to get on the water. Here in Massachusetts in June, it's hot and humid, and I had a brook trout I could see chilling out in shallow water in the shade. I was throwing everything in my kit at it, and it wouldn't take. That was the theme for the whole day, seeing lots of fish, none of them wanting to eat. My question is, do you have any advice for when you get out there and it's hot, 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 and the fish apparently aren't feeling it?" Chris, this is a great question, and it's very timely because we just had our first 100-degree days here in Wyoming, and I'm ready to move to Alaska at this point because I can't stand the heat. Oh, my parents live down in southern Utah by Zion National Park, and I refuse to go visit them from about May until September because it's just too hot for me. I can't do the heat. So anyways, it sounds like what happened, Chris, is that you ran into trout that were sitting in water that is too hot for fishing. And that is a thing. I alluded to it a little bit earlier in the show when we talked about the Firehole River and its short fishing season because the water gets too hot. But let's dive into that a little bit more here. trout are pretty temperamental creatures. And during the hottest parts of the summer, even here in the Rockies, we have to stop fishing sometimes if the water gets too warm. I'll give you an example. Last year, Alex and I were out fishing. We were down in Utah. We were fishing one of Alex's favorite rivers, and it has a reputation for warming up pretty quickly. And we got there, and we got into the water, and it felt just almost too warm. And as we fished for about an hour, hour and a half, we could feel the water warming up noticeably. And it got to the point where we both looked at each other and were like, yeah, this water is too warm. We're not going to fish today. We're going to leave. So we left and we went somewhere else because we just didn't want to add more stress onto the fish. Now, we did that because, and when I say more stress onto the fish, we stop fishing when the water gets warm because warmer water has less dissolved oxygen in it. And oxygen's kind of critical for fish. Even though they live in the water, they breathe it, right? They separate the oxygen in the water. That's what their gills are for. And after fighting, if you hook into them, oxygen's critical for a fish to recover after a fight. I mean, think about when, if you're like me and I've started going back to the gym because, I got to be able to fit into my waders come winter, right? And, I'm running on the treadmill. And if I stopped running, if I was finished and somebody just puts their hand over my mouth, and I'm going to have a really hard time breathing in through that. I'm going to get less oxygen. It's going to take me a lot longer to recover, and it might even cause some serious side effects. Well, that's the same thing that happens with trout. If the water's so warm, there's not enough dissolved oxygen in it to help them recover after the fight, there's actually a really good chance that the trout will die because trout are pretty fragile creatures. Now, there's a lot of science on this too. This isn't just me like, oh, this is what I heard from a guide one time. This is scientific. It's backed up by a lot of information. And the resource that I'll direct you to on this is the folks over at Keep Fish Wet. There will be a link to everything for them in the show notes today, so check that out. But they've got all the info on all this stuff. Specifically, though, they did a story just on dissolved oxygen in warmer water, and I'll link this in the show notes as well. But it gets into the science, and part of that story discusses an experiment where researchers found that in high water temperatures, which were above 73 degrees Fahrenheit, 40% of fish died after being caught, which is insane. That's a lot of fish dying after being caught. And trout, like I said, trout are a lot like me in the heat. They hate it. They slow down. They don't do much. They really thrive in water that's between 34 and 67 degrees. And it's generally recommended to stop fishing if the water you're in hits 68 degrees Fahrenheit. A reading that high will shut down some of those storied fisheries that we discussed earlier in the show. The Madison shuts down sometimes. The Big Hole shuts down sometimes because if the water gets above 68, then they're done. Like Montana's Fish, Wildlife, and Park Service will shut it down for the afternoon, and you can't fish it again until the next morning after the water's had a chance to cool down. It is frustrating to experience that, but if you're out on the water and it's that hot, then it's probably just time to call it for the day and fish something other than trout. Bass, carp, and there's other fish that are more tolerant of high water temps can be a lot of fun on a fly rod. Catfish can be fun. I haven't caught those on a fly rod yet. I need to. But if you know that your only day to fish is going to be when it's really hot, then your best bet is to get out early in the morning before the water heats up and then stop fishing once it hits 68 degrees. I know a lot of anglers who carry a little thermometer during the summer just for that reason. You generally don't have to worry about temps going way too high on tailwaters or spring creeks because the temps in those fisheries stay fairly stable year round. But again, like I mentioned, even places like the Madison gets closed due to high water temps. So it is something you want to be aware of and just make sure that you're not putting too much stress on the fish as you're out there trying to have fun. So hopefully that helps, Chris. And thanks for sending that question on in. I appreciate it. Josh from Missouri has our next question, writes in and says, "Hey, Spencer, I am learning a lot from the podcast. I was curious as to why fly fishers don't use barrel swivels for easy changing of flies. Got to keep the fly in the water longer and make it easier to not tie so many knots. Thanks." Josh, good question. I appreciate that you're learning stuff from the show as well. Thank you. I really like your question though. You're thinking outside the box a little bit. I like that. Um, there's really no real reason to not use a swivel for something like a streamer or even popper flies if you're chasing bass or other stuff that you're using topwater flies for. But if you're looking to use a swivel just to save time from tying knots, then I'd suggest that you spend more time practicing your knots so you're a bit quicker at them. And I'm not like coming down on you or anything, but the clinch knot is so simple that maybe I'll time myself doing this because I bet it's just as quick as doing up a swivel. I used to spin and bait fish a ton as a kid, so I'm pretty familiar with swivels and how they work. And that clinch knot, man, that's so quick, so easy, so effective. I don't think there's a. I would be very surprised if there was a significant time savings or with using a swivel over just tying a clinch knot. So that's my first bit of advice here. But I would say that the main reason to shy away from using a swivel in fly fishing is the potential impact that that swivel might have on the presentation of your flies. And for the purposes of our discussion, I'm going to assume that you're talking about the barrel swivels with the snap on them like you'd use for fishing a Rapala or a Panther Martin, right? Because a regular, like quote unquote, just regular barrel swivel would still require you to tie tippet onto it, and that's not going to save you any potential time on tying on new flies. So with that style swivel, the barrel swivel with the snap, we would need to thread the eye of, let's just take a nymph, through the snap closure and then close it up, right? And even with micro swivels, though, I'm not sure the nymph will be able to move freely on that snap closure. It's got the metal that it's got to sit on right there. I just don't know that it's going to move freely, and so I don't think you're going to get a natural drift. A larger nymph might, but like our smaller scuds, our midges, our mayfly nymphs, they're probably just not going to drift naturally. And if that fly can't move freely in the water, then it's not going to look real. And if it doesn't look real, then you probably won't catch fish on it. As we know, a good drift has to look natural if you want fish to pay attention to it. And just for those who may not know, when we talk about drift, we're talking about exactly what it sounds like. It's how your fly moves in the water. And you want that drift to look as natural as possible. For dry flies, the image that we always use to teach this here at VFC is imagine a leaf falling on the river, right? As the leaf goes down the river, it's not pulling and moving against different currents. It's moving with them, right? You want your dry flies to do the same thing. And that goes with nymphs too. You want your nymphs to be carried and moved by the water. And if they're not able to move freely, like if they're on that barrel swivel and they get hung up or something, I just don't know that that's going to give you the best presentation you can possibly have. And trout are very good at identifying stuff that doesn't look natural. And that is the number one cause. I think we talked about this on episode 81 as well, where presentation is the number one reason why you don't catch fish. It's not your fly selection, right? It's not where you're standing. It's not your casting. It's your presentation. Okay, because if you can't get that fly to look natural, the trout know it, and that's what's going to give you the biggest stumbling block in catching trout on a fly rod. Obviously, we wouldn't use barrel swivels on dry flies because A, it's going to pull the dry fly down and sink it, which is counterintuitive to dry flies. And then that metal swivel is going to land with extra noise and disturbance on the water. And that's just going to instantly let fish know that it's not a real fly. So that's really why we don't use barrel swivels, Josh. But I like I said, I appreciate that you were thinking outside the box. I like it. That's the kind of thinking we need in the community. So thank you very much for sending that question on in. TJ from LA has our next question, writes in and says, "Hey, Spencer, I know when you see that I'm from Los Angeles, you're going to wonder if I usually fly fish in a storm drain, but most people would be blown away by how many miles of wild trout streams are within 60 to 90 minutes of downtown LA. The opportunities for catching wild and even native trout here are incredible. I've been a fan of your podcast for some time and really enjoy the ability to learn more about the sport as I make my way through the traffic out here." Yeah, that LA traffic's no joke, man. My question is about the pros and cons of different dry dropper setups. I usually tie my dropper nymph off the bend of the dry fly hook, but a few people have told me that this impedes the dry fly's ability to drift naturally because it makes the dropper off the hook into a rudder that only lets the fly drift one way. They suggested tying the dropper from the eye of the dry fly hook, and I was wondering what your opinion of this method is. Thanks for taking my question, and I have no strong opinion about diet sodas. Well, TJ, I bet your kidneys thank you for no strong opinion about diet sodas. This is a really, really, really good question. Thank you for sending this in. We'll have some graphics that'll pop up on the screen here if you're watching the podcast to help you understand, because it is kind of hard to describe just through words. I will do my best, but there will be some graphics to help. But just starting out, I've never heard someone say that the dropper in a dry dropper rig acts as a rudder that controls the drift of the dry fly if it's tied off the bend of the hook of that dry fly. And to be completely honest, I don't buy that. I think it's a false assumption. And I'm not trying to talk down on these folks. I don't think it's true, and I'll tell you why. Let's say that we rig up the dry dropper the way that you talked about, where we get our dry fly and we tie it onto the end of our tippet. Then we want a dropper on that. So instead of tying off the bend of the hook, what we do is we take our piece of tippet. Okay, it's going to be 18 inches long is what we say is a good base to start with. So we take that and we're going to put that through the eye of the dry fly hook. Okay, so we've got two pieces of line coming out of the eye of the dry fly hook there. Now, when you tie your dropper on through the eye of the dry fly hook like that, you're creating a direct connection between that dry fly and the nymph below it because you're pulling directly on the eye of the hook. Okay, instead of that weight being near the rear of the fly, it's right there on the eye of the hook, which, in my opinion, and I've seen this, I've toyed around with this a little bit, that's going to drastically change how that fly rides in the water. It's gonna land like nose or head first. That also means that because there's a direct connection between the dry fly and the nymph, that the dry fly is going to move with the nymph. Okay, they're going to be moving and almost pulling against each other, creating tension against each other. And that's problematic because I'm not aware of a river where the current moves at the exact same speed on the top as it does 18 inches or even 2 feet below the surface. Okay, we know that there's always change in water speed from the surface to the bottom of the river. Now, that change might be gradual, but we know there's a change. And if you have your flies directly connected to each other, but they're in different currents, you're going to get drag, you're going to get them pulling against each other. So unless you're landing in the exact same current every time, I think you're going to see some drag. You're going to see some presentation issues there. I actually think you're going to end up with more drag in your dry fly if you tie a dry dropper through the eye of the dry fly hook instead of off the bend. Now, when you tie it off the bend of the hook instead, your second fly, it's not as directly connected to that dry fly. Okay, it allows both of the flies to drift without pulling against each other. There's less tension on them. They can just move around a bit more freely. The dry fly is also going to ride more naturally in the water because you don't have weight pulling on the eye of the hook. I know that what we've done is we're like, well, yeah, we don't have it moving on the eye of the hook, but we've moved that weight to the bend of the hook. Well, how is that any different? Well, it allows the dry fly to settle naturally on the water surface without its head being pulled down. And if you think about it, when a fly is stuck in the surface film and it's trying to get off of the river, what moves first? Its tail or its head? Yeah, its head. That lifts off first. So overall, I think tying it off the bend of the hook is going to give you a more natural presentation. That's how the flies settle on the water. I think you're going to get a more natural presentation tying it off the bend of the hook. I'd also say it's a lot simpler to tie it off the bend of the hook as well. Cramming 2 clinch knots into the eye of the single hook can be a lot, especially on smaller flies. And I can't imagine that all those knots jammed up against each other are going to help it drift naturally either, especially if you maybe use tippet a little bit bigger than you should have. That's probably going to cause some micro drag on that dry fly. And personally, I don't know any guides who rig up their dry droppers with the dropper going through the eye of the dry fly hook. Every guide I know personally that I fish with who I know is a good angler, they tie it off the bend of the hook. And I think that just makes a big difference in how it floats. And the majority of anglers I know all tie off the bend of the hook. There's a reason we do that, and I believe that's because you're going to get the best presentation possible with that setup, because it allows both flies to move more independently of each other. Now, all of that said, I do know a couple anglers who fish their dry droppers with the dropper tied off through the eye of the dry fly hook, and they seem to catch fish okay. So it's entirely possible that I'm just making too big a deal out of it here, but they're in the extreme minority. Like 99% of the anglers I know tie their droppers off the bend of the hook. So that's what I would recommend doing. Again, I've never heard that that argument that, well, the dropper coming off the bend of the hook acts as a rudder. I think if it's super short, it could, but your dry dropper rig's usually a lot longer than that. So I would just stick with tying it off the bend of the hook. I think you're going to be in great shape. That's what I do. It hasn't let me down yet, and I have yet to find a compelling reason to change it. But thank you very much for sending that question in, TJ, and good luck out there in that LA traffic. Curtis from Melbourne has our next question. He writes in and says, "Hello, I just moved from Calgary, Alberta to Melbourne, Australia. The fly fishing scene is pretty small out here. Was wondering what your approach would be to scouting new fishing spots and selecting flies in an area that is so different than the Rockies. Thank you for all your work with the show and the educational videos you guys put out." Curtis, that's a heck of a move, but congrats. Thanks for the kind words. I appreciate it. I have no idea what the trout fishing is like in Melbourne. But even if you don't have trout in your local rivers, I'm sure that if you go out to them, you're still going to find fish holding in similar types of water. Riffles, pools, runs, all those water types that we've discussed and talked about in our masterclass and here on the podcast. Those water types are still going to produce the right conditions for aquatic insects to exist. And where those insects exist, say that 10 times fast, fish are likely to feed on them. All right, that's something we know. That's the law of the universe. If there's insects in the water, then daggone, there's probably fish who are going to snack on them. Now, I would also follow the same formula that we've established for picking flies as well, which is our right fly formula. This is our foolproof way to pick a fly no matter what, and that is where you want to pick a fly based on first the size, and then the shape, and then the color of the natural bugs that you see out there on the water. So, Curtis, go out there to the water and spend some time watching for a minute. Okay, what's going on? Are there bugs out? If so, can you see fish eating those bugs? If not, then you're going to want to start turning over rocks in the river and matching the bugs that you see underneath those rocks to the flies in your box, again, using our right fly formula. So as far as selecting flies, and, if you found water and you're like, well, I don't know if there's fish in there, look for the water types that we've talked about, runs, riffles, pools. Okay, you're going to find fish there. As far as flies, pick some rocks up, look and see what's around there. Okay, now, I don't know if it's trout, if it's bass, or I don't know if there's some weird Australian fish that will jump out of the water and eat you because everything in Australia seems to want to kill you. But, whatever the case may be there, as far as understanding what fish you've got and where to go, then I would highly recommend Googling just fishing in Melbourne and seeing what comes up, because I think you'll be very surprised at how much information's out there on the internet. It's kind of scary. But that's the internet for you. It's kind of scary. That should be the internet's tagline. The internet, kind of scary. Anyways, we also did just release a brand new masterclass video on this exact topic for finding new places to fish. Alex walks you through everything that he and I do to find new places to fish. I highly recommend checking that video out. I'll link it in the show notes. The other big tip that I'd give you, though, is you're in a place that's so different. Again, I have no clue what the fishing's like in Melbourne, that I would go find some outdoor shops. If there's a fly shop, even better. But just go to an outdoor shop and see what info you can get from other fishing folks. My experience has been that a lot of people there are very willing to point you in the right direction. They're very willing to talk and to help you out. And the intel that they have is going to be invaluable in at least pointing you in generally the right direction for where you need to go. So I would do that stuff, and let us know. I would love to know what the fishing's like in Melbourne. So maybe you can send that in for the live real life moment here in a couple weeks. See what I'm doing there, Curtis? Because that's a perfect segue, because we finished with the Q&A section. So that's a perfect segue into our live real life moment. The first one, the inaugural live real life moment. I'm gonna share a moment this week, and this is just my own moment of living real life. And we've got a picture of this beautiful cutthroat that I caught here in Wyoming just a couple of weeks ago. Actually, I was driving down to Utah to go film and fish with Alex, and I had to stop and fish on my way, and I caught this fish. And I was on this river where I've been fishing. It's one of my local tailwaters, and I've been fishing it a lot lately because the fishing's been really good. And the fish had been in pretty shallow water. They've been holding in shallow water. They've really kind of moved to the riffles for the summer. They're just chowing down on all the caddis and yellow sallies that are out. But that day, I got to the river, and I'm fishing the riffles, and nothing. The fish just aren't there. And I'm starting to think, oh, great. This is not how I want to start my trip down to Utah by getting skunked. I was worried. Because when Alex and I are out filming, we kind of need the fish to help us out with that. I did not want to bring bad luck with me on the trip. Well, I pulled over for a second. I got out of the water and I sat on the bank, and I'm just watching the river for a minute, and I'd spooked a couple of fish. And I noticed that the fish I'd spooked as I was waiting were in deeper water. They were holding down deeper in the pools, and they only spooked when I got right up on them. And I was toying with the idea of changing my fly out. I was fishing a hopper dropper, and I'd been fishing a big crawdad nymph because that's what they've been eating a whole bunch of lately. But there weren't really many bugs out. So I was like, well, I don't know. Is there even really a hatch going on? I'm like, well, come on, it's June. It was June when this happened. It's like, how maybe I'll go, maybe I'll throw a caddis on or something like that. But what I ended up doing was I just added a little bit more weight to that fly just to get it down a little bit deeper because the water was moving pretty quick. And so instead of changing my fly, like I mentioned earlier in the show, the presentation's almost always the issue, right? So instead of changing the fly, I added a little bit more weight. I got it down deep enough. And literally the second cast that I did that, I put it through a deeper spot. Boom, caught this beautiful cutthroat, right? So it's just a good example of we've got to work for it sometimes. You've got to take what the river tells you. You've got to pay attention to it. You got to grind, but the work is rewarding when it happens. So that's my example of living real life and how I lived real life lately. And I cannot wait to see what live real life submissions y'all have got for us. So please do not hesitate to send those in. Okay, there's always a link in the show notes for that. And if you've got a question that you would like answered on the show, if you want some help with a fly fishing topic, there's always a link to send your questions into us as well. That's what the show runs on. We are fueled by your questions. That we would not have Untangled without your questions. So we need them. Please send them on in. There's no question too small or too big to answer on the show. We'll tackle them all here. And if you could, please take a minute to rate and subscribe to the show. When you do that, it helps folks see the show more. It gives us better visibility, and that helps us help more anglers live real life and have a fantastic day on the water. And speaking of the water, enough of me yammering. Okay, it's fishing season. Get out there, get out on the water, find some fish, and until next week, tight lines, everybody.